Let me start with something that sounds obvious, but actually isn't. What you're seeing right now in American sports culture, the non-stop gambling ads, the parlays shoved into broadcasts, the sense that betting is now just part of the game, this didn't happen because Americans suddenly woke up and decided they love gambling. This happened because the system quietly redesigned sports fandom. And once you see how it was done, it becomes very hard to unsee. Because this wasn't an accident. It wasn't organic. And it definitely wasn't inevitable. It was engineered, legally, politically, and psychologically. Everything begins with one of those classic Washington, nobody noticed, moments. In 2006, Congress passed the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, the UIGEA, almost as an afterthought, jammed into a completely unrelated port security bill. No national debate. No cultural reckoning. Just paperwork and signatures. The law did something very specific. It banned online gambling companies from processing payments that violated state or federal law. But buried inside that ban was a loophole so small it seemed harmless at the time. Fantasy sports were explicitly exempted. Not because lawmakers loved fantasy football, but because fantasy sports were framed as games of skill, not chance. You weren't betting on dice or roulette. You were researching stats, building rosters, and competing intellectually. And in 2006, that distinction made sense. Fantasy sports were slow, seasonal, nerdy. Office leagues. Trash talk. A $50 buy-in, if that. Nobody was getting rich. Nobody was losing their mortgage. So Congress shrugged and moved on. That shrug ended up creating one of the most profitable behavioral pipelines in modern American history. Fast forward to 2009. South by Southwest. Austin, Texas. Two startups, FanDuel and later DraftKings, look at fantasy sports and realize something important. Fantasy didn't have to be slow. It could be daily. It could be mobile. And most importantly, it could be financially explosive. Instead of waiting an entire season, players could now reset every day. Instead of competing with coworkers, they could enter massive public tournaments. Instead of $50 leagues, they could chase life-changing payouts. FanDuel's pitch was intoxicating. One good day could make you thousands. And legally? They were clean. Because fantasy sports weren't gambling. By 2013, FanDuel had raised over $11 million. That same year, it awarded a $1 million prize and paid out more than $150 million in winnings. DraftKings wasn't far behind. Then something remarkable happened. These companies didn't just buy ads. They outspent the beer industry on national television. Every 90 seconds, another fantasy ad. During football. During basketball. During baseball. Everywhere. This wasn't marketing, it was saturation. And slowly, almost invisibly, the cultural definition of betting began to shift. If daily fantasy felt like gambling, maybe gambling wasn't so bad after all. Here's a data point that matters. In 1993, 56% of Americans opposed legalized sports betting. It was seen as corrupt, dangerous, and antithetical to fair competition. Even as late as 2012, every major sports league commissioner publicly opposed legalization. The NFL, the NBA, MLB, the NCAA, all against it, at least on paper. But behind closed doors, something changed. Fantasy sports didn't just generate money. They generated engagement. Fans watched more games, stayed longer, cared more about meaningless matchups because their roster depended on it. And leagues noticed. At the same time, Americans were already betting, just illegally. The American Gaming Association estimated roughly $150 billion per year was being wagered, mostly offshore. That number became the industry's favorite talking point. They're doing it anyway. Why not regulate it? By 2017, public opinion flipped. 55% now supported legalized sports betting. That's not a cultural evolution. That's a reframing campaign. In 2018, the Supreme Court struck down the federal ban on sports betting, ruling that Congress had overstepped its authority. States could decide for themselves. That's the moment most people remember. What they forget is that the industry was already waiting, with lobbyists, draft legislation, tax arguments, and talking points preloaded. This wasn't a state-by-state debate about ethics. It was a race. A race to legalize fast, and on the friendliest terms possible. Lobbyists moved from Trenton to Tallahassee to Topeka. Wine dinners. Talking points. Promises of easy tax revenue. And it worked. By 2022, 30 states plus Washington, D.C. had legalized some form of sports betting. But this wasn't your grandfather's sportsbook. This was mobile. Always on. Always accessible. Bet on the game. Then the half. Then the quarter. Then the next play. You no longer had to wait for outcomes. You could bet inside the experience. That's the critical shift. Betting stopped being an add-on. It became a layer of the broadcast itself. Between 2018 and 2021, U.S. sports betting revenue didn't just grow, it tripled, reaching over $4.3 billion annually. Today, estimates put annual revenue closer to $12 billion, with over 16 million monthly users on major apps. The industry tells a comforting story: this was always happening underground. We just brought it into the light. That's only half true. Yes, illegal betting existed. But this scale didn't. What changed wasn't legality, it was design. Apps were built to remove friction. Ads were built to normalize risk. Promotions were built to turn curiosity into habit. And the pandemic gave the industry the perfect cover. In 2020, as sports returned in empty arenas, betting ads flooded broadcasts. Logos appeared on scoreboards, virtual fans, and commentary desks. When nothing felt normal, gambling started to feel normal. That wasn't an accident. That was timing. Let's start with the promise that sold legalization to state lawmakers: easy money. Flip the switch, collect taxes, fund schools, fix roads. Simple. Except it didn't work out that way. In at least 14 jurisdictions, states that followed industry advice on competitive tax rates collected nearly $150 million less than projected in 2022 alone. Why? Because gambling companies negotiated two crucial advantages: lower tax rates, supposedly to encourage competition. Massive advertising deductions, especially for so-called promotional bets. Those free bets you see everywhere? They aren't free. In 2022 alone, sportsbooks gave out almost $1 billion in promotional credits. States allowed most of that to be deducted from taxable revenue, costing governments over $120 million in lost taxes. So the irony is brutal. States legalized betting for revenue. Betting companies used promotions to reduce that revenue. Taxpayers quietly ate the difference. Kansas lost money. You lost money. Only one side didn't. Casinos have always known a truth that polite conversation avoids: gambling revenue doesn't come evenly from all players. Roughly 40% of gambling revenue comes from the top 5% of gamblers, the so-called high rollers, or, less politely, problem gamblers. This isn't speculation. It's standard industry math. In Vegas, casinos hire hosts whose entire job is to keep those players betting longer and bigger, through comps, perks, and psychological nudges. Online sportsbooks didn't reinvent that system. They automated it. Instead of a human host, you get personalized bonuses, loss rebates, VIP offers triggered by losing streaks, push notifications timed to moments of emotional vulnerability. And it works. Not because users are stupid, but because addiction is a design variable. In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association officially classified gambling disorder as an addiction, activating the same neural pathways as alcohol, nicotine, and cocaine. This isn't a metaphor. It's neurochemistry. Sportsbooks love to frame betting as entertainment. But structurally, these apps look less like games and more like behavioral extraction systems. They borrow variable reward schedules from slot machines, streak-based incentives from video games, social normalization from social media, frictionless payment design from fintech. You don't just place a bet. You are nudged to increase stake size, encouraged to parlay unrelated events, tempted to chase losses with risk-free offers, re-engaged through notifications that feel personal. And crucially, you never play against other players. In sports betting, you always play against the house, which bakes its margin into every line. Even a fair bet carries a built-in disadvantage. Over time, the math is relentless. Skill might delay losses. It cannot eliminate them. The house doesn't need you to lose today. It just needs you to keep playing. Here's the key difference between modern sports betting and traditional casinos. Casinos were geographically limited. Apps are psychologically omnipresent. You had to go to Vegas. Now Vegas lives in your phone. You had to make an effort. Now effort is optional. You had downtime between bets. Now you can bet every minute of a game. This isn't an upgrade. It's an acceleration. And the most aggressively targeted demographic isn't retirees or tourists. It's men aged 18 to 35, statistically more prone to risk-taking, impulsivity, and long-term gambling. That's why betting ads flooded at sports broadcasts, podcasts, YouTube and college campuses. Some universities even received $30 per student sign-up from sportsbook partnerships, until public backlash forced cancellations. When your business model depends on early habit formation, that's not marketing. That's recruitment. If this story sounds familiar, it should. Richard Daynard, the lawyer behind Big Tobacco's $200+ billion settlement, has publicly drawn parallels between gambling and cigarettes, addictive product, aggressive normalization, regulatory capture, externalized social costs. The playbook is identical: normalize use, downplay harm, blame individuals, fight regulation and settle decades later. The difference? Sports betting wrapped itself in sports, the most emotionally trusted cultural institution in America. It didn't ask fans to change behavior. It monetized behavior they already loved. So what did America actually legalize? Not gambling. America legalized frictionless loss extraction, scaled by software, protected by lobbying, and normalized by culture. Yes, some people bet responsibly. Yes, some people win occasionally. Yes, prohibition failed. All of that can be true at the same time. But pretending this system is neutral, or benign, is intellectually dishonest. Because when revenue depends on addiction, and taxes depend on losses, and regulation depends on industry goodwill, the incentives are upside down. The house always wins. The question is whether the rest of society is willing to keep paying, quietly, gradually, and permanently, for the privilege of calling it entertainment.